When you ask the big questions of life, who do you ask those questions to? When you're wrestling with, what do I do with my life? Where do I invest my money? What do I do with my belongings? What do I do with my time? Where do you direct those questions? This week, we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 12, where Jesus tells the parable of the rich fool. And this summer, we're working through the parables of Jesus, and it's been really powerful and insightful to look at these stories that he's told and apply them to our lives. And in this story, Jesus tells of a man who was called a rich fool. And as I was getting ready to talk about this Sunday, I realized something that I'd never seen before in this story. But this guy in the story is asking one of these huge life questions, and he has this massive conversation with just himself. And it was really convicting as I read this and realized what Jesus was saying, because I thought, how often do we do the same thing? We have these huge life questions like, where do I invest my time? Where do I invest my resources? And instead of seeking God, instead of seeking wise counsel, we just have this internal dialogue. Listen to the words of Jesus as he tells this story. It's in Luke chapter 12. It says, "The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." So this story starts out with this farmer, and he has a huge harvest one year. So he's got all these extra crops, and he asks the question, what shall I do with these extra crops? Where do I store them? Which is a valid question. It's a good question. But the problems start with where he gets the answer. Verse 18, "Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain." So as I was studying this, I realized first he asked a really good question. What do I do with the excess? What do I do with the abundance? What do I do with the extra? But instead of seeking counsel, instead of seeking God, he actually just answers his own question. He goes, I know what I'll do. I'll build bigger barns. Now listen to how this guy ends this dialogue. Verse 19 says, "And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." So not only does he ask the question and then answer his own question, he actually plans in the future what he'll say to himself. So he says, and then once all that's done, once I build these bigger barns, I'll sit back and say to myself, well done. Now you can just rest and be merry. There's no more worries, there's no more cares. And so as I was studying this and I realized what this man had done, I realized that Jesus is warning you and I about the same thing, that we shouldn't have internal dialogue about these major questions of life, that instead we should turn to God. The way that this story ends is actually pretty sad. In verse 20, God breaks in to this internal dialogue. It says, "But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?" The reason this man is called a fool is because he thought that he could ordain his life, that he could make things go a certain way, that he could fix it to be a certain way, and then he could rest easy that it was going to happen the way that he had planned. And God said, you're a fool. You don't have control over your life. And what Jesus is telling us from this story is, don't just have an internal dialogue about these major life questions. Seek out the voice of God. Let him lead you. And what I want to say to you this week is that God is a loving Father who loves you and who cares for you and wants to be included on these life decisions. So seek out the Lord and let him lead you by the power of his Holy Spirit.